series, which John's getting started up, which is great. John, I love that you're like Johnny on the spot all the time, and that your name is actually John. We're starting up a new teaching series today on the character of Jesus, on the person of Jesus, and a lot to talk about today, so I'm just going to jump in. I already told you my name is Matt. Okay, good. That's it for pleasantries. It'll be pleasant, but we're just going to jump in. At ECV, we tend to describe following Jesus in, what I'll say is very episodic terms. What does that word mean? I mean, in very dynamic terms. It's something that happens in time and space, and you can't predict its outcome from the start. You simply have to live it. And I think that all of this is a really useful way of talking about following Jesus. And at the end of the day, it's no matter what I say today, it's still the foundation of everything. Listen, discern, obey. Really, that's it. In terms of life with God, there's nothing at least that doesn't fit somewhere within that grid. And to the extent to which we're given instead to swap out this grid for one that replaces all of the kind of dynamic interaction with something much more reliable but dead, I think actually we do better with this, right? To insist on the foolish simplicity of this mantra, listen, discern, obey. We could summarize all of these if we wanted to get even simpler in follow, right? Jesus is constantly inviting people, come follow me. However, there's a danger, I think, if we start to think about this whole process in thoroughly episodic terms, if we just think about it as one command followed by another, followed by another, followed by another, and that is this: it can start to feel a little bit arbitrary, more like orders received from afar than like a dynamic relationship. As if each time we pray, we're just shaking the magic Jesus 8-ball, right? If there's something helpful captured in that about the dynamism and the fundamentally open nature about interaction with the living God, then so be it. I think we can probably do a little bit better than like the magic Jesus 8-ball, though. Now, we get that dynamism, I think, in spades when we talk, as I did 2 weeks ago, about following Jesus as the good shepherd, whose voice we discern and who we follow rather plainly, rather simply, in ways that only sheep can. Or maybe the only way that sheep can. But there's something else that we find as we do this, and not to give up the whole paradigm, listen, discern, obey, but rather to augment it slightly. I think we might say this: as we listen, as we discern, and especially as we obey, I take it that we begin to learn not just the voice of the shepherd, but also his character. We get a sense of what he's like, what his habits are, which paths he tends to prefer, from which hilltops does he have the best vantage point from which to keep guard on us and keep us safe from the wolves. What kind of fondness does this shepherd have for us, his sheep? What sorts of commands are likely to come in a given situation? We get a sense of his character, not so that we can stop listening, not so that we can abstract a system and dispense with the person, but rather so that we can listen more carefully, we can discern more accurately, we can follow more courageously. And frankly, the fact is that we're not sheep. We're people, we're humans, if you hadn't figured that out. And Jesus is too. Now, he's a peculiar kind of human, but as we'll see, Jesus is peculiar not because he's less than human or even because he's more than human, but rather that he's just most human. And because we're all of the same type as Jesus, learning his character, and it will always have to do with learning to imitate his character. Imitation, which we could imagine, is simply another mode in which we follow him. Following not just the direction that he goes, but also following in the way, imitating the way in which he carries himself, imitating the person that he is. And that, of course, is our focus for the next several weeks. Now, for most of the talks in this series, we're going to be working rather inductively, looking just at a story of the life of Jesus, and then from that, trying to kind of think about, all right, what is the character like? What is this person like? But for this talk, we're going to do something a little bit different. And instead, I'm at least going to begin with one of the Gospel's most famous summaries of Jesus' character. And beginning with that summary, we'll go with there. I'm going to begin with the Gospel of John's description of Jesus as the Word made flesh, which is an admittedly obscure phrase taken on its own. And it's a phrase connected with yet more technical theological language, like the doctrine of the incarnation. That is the statement that the person of Jesus, in the person of Jesus, the God of the universe, took on flesh, took on meat, carne, if that's not getting too literal about it. But we're gonna start here with this phrase, the Word made flesh, and we'll use it as a way of talking about the nearness of Jesus. The nearness of Jesus, which is in fact very much is a characteristic of the life of Jesus that we can observe in the Gospels, and I think that we experience quite regularly in our lives as we dynamically have this relationship following Jesus. Now, I suppose like any good introductory talk, this talk will contain the seeds of everything that is to come. In describing the nearness of Jesus, we will necessarily also talk about the compassion of Jesus, the heart of Jesus, his presence. We'll talk about his orientation to us, his fundamental decision to be for us, to be in our corner, to be our friend. But also this nearness is the nearness of an other, indeed of otherness itself. That otherness is ultimately what makes Jesus' presence to us so impactful. It also is what leads to our rejection of him and his love for us taking the form of sacrifice for us at our hands. So all of this, in some sense, flows from the nearness of Jesus made known to us in the incarnation and his taking on flesh. So that's where we're going today. I mean, of course, we're not just talking about the nearness of Jesus. I believe that, in fact, Jesus is near. He's here with us in this space. And so before we get too much further into this, I just like to pray for us that we would be aware of God's presence here. So, Lord, we just thank you that you are present here in this space. We thank you that you've been present with us in worship and in fellowship and in hearing about the things that you're doing in our community. And Lord, I just pray that you would incline our ears to be able to hear your voice. You open our eyes to be able to see you and what you're as you draw near to us here in this space today. Amen. Let's look at this passage here. In the beginning was the Word. This is from the beginning of John's Gospel, one of the ancient accounts of the life of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and dwelled and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, John says, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. There's a lot there. We won't get to all of it. I will just admit from the beginning. But again and again in this passage, in this beautiful, deep passage, John describes Jesus as the Word. And for an ancient person like John, we probably think he seemed to be inclined in a kind of Platonic direction. He was into the philosophy of Plato. For an ancient person like that, this had a very specific, very technical meaning. But I take it it's not very hard to get a general sense of the basic instinct here. Words are mediators. They're bridges. They're go-betweens. Words communicate. Words take what is inaccessibly interior to me and somehow transfer that to you. They transport ideas into the material world. And again, for someone who is subscribed, as John did probably to the philosophy of Plato, the basic sense is that words do this incredibly well. And that means that there's a relationship between the real and the ideal. To Christian Platonists like John, well-versed in the Hebrew Scriptures, it is quite significant that God, in the beginning, as John reminds us, creates through speech. That is, through the word, through the spoken word. God says, "Let there be," and there is. The ideas in God's mind become material in the act of creation through the Word of God. Of course, in our culture, we're often a bit more skeptical about words, much more aware of their ability to fail, to come up short. But deeper than that, we have a sense that words may not attach to the real at all, that discourses, systems of words may conspire to produce the very objects that they purport to describe. They may do this in ways that are apparently harmless and playful, words just kind of have free associations, or with more, okay, you got it, or in ways that end up being having a little bit more sinister effects. That is, words don't just describe the world and mediate it to various subjects. Words actually create worlds. And it's their tremendous success at doing this, in creating worlds, that makes their generative, creative work so hard to see. It all just seems so given, so natural. Words seem merely to mediate worlds that they have in actuality produced. But there we go again, talking about the Word and creation. From this postmodern perspective, perhaps it's only that much more true to say that God creates the world through the Word, that is, by means of words. The Word is what creates not just the world as such, but the world as it's actually significant to us, as it has meaning for us. And that necessarily has to do with specific cultural systems, various different cultural contexts in which certain categories are assumed to be natural or given or essential or objectively real, right, in some sense. The culture, of course, is precisely the domain of language, the dominion of the word. And that was one of the ways that the Platonists around the time of John's time would use this. They would talk about the Word of God as that which allowed some kind of relationship between various different kinds of cultures. People who wouldn't otherwise understand each other, they said, but there's a rationality, there's something sitting behind all of this. John says that's who Jesus is. However we think about words, whether we think of them as mediating our access to one another and to the reality of the world around us, or we think of them rather creating the worlds that we inhabit, I take it that John's image is still quite potent for us. The Word is that which founds relationships. The Word is that which connects us to one another and to the world as we know it. And even more, the Word connects us to God, to the transcendent, to what lies beyond. The Word demonstrates that this transcendent reality is not just pie in the sky. It's not just fancy stuff philosophers think about. The Word shows us that what is beyond, what we can't actually comprehend with our minds, is somehow implicated in every aspect of our everyday lives. Indeed, as John insists, the Word itself is transcendent. It's, in some sense, God. No one has seen God, but the Son, the Word, he who is himself is God in some sense, has made God known. Given the fundamental way in which the Word has structured this reality, we are always already engaged with the Word, with this transcendent aspect of the world all around us, because the Word created the worlds we inhabit. And John argues Jesus comes to us. Jesus, the person of Jesus, comes to us as this Word. Jesus comes to us as the one who is somehow both totally other, totally transcendent, and yet also intimately near. And he demonstrates this nearness precisely in his becoming flesh, becoming like us. Not just mediating the world as we know it as significant to us, but entering that world itself, becoming a part of it, taking up a dwelling among us. Jesus draws near. This is the fundamental character of Jesus. He is God among us, God dwelling among us or even within us. As Eugene Peterson puts it, Jesus is God deciding to move into the neighborhood. Jesus is the one always and everywhere taking the initiative, taking the first step to bridge whatever divide exists. He does it better than any of us ever could. As the Word, he's the very ground of what makes that possible and what makes that possible for us. In becoming flesh and dwelling among us, Jesus, the Word who himself is God, God becomes like us. And so God moves from the universal to the particular. And this is what wrecked Greek philosophical minds, and John's trying to make some sense of all this business about the word, and I promise you we're going to get less abstract from here on in, all right, because we're going to leave this bit behind to a certain extent. Because perhaps the point is not to try to make sense of it, though some of us make a living trying to do that, but maybe the point is at some level to just allow ourselves to be wrecked by it, to hit the rocks, right? To hit the rocks and encountering a God who took on flesh, which meant choosing a particular flesh, which a sexed body and a gendered identity that a particular cultural location assigned to that sexed body, a flesh that existed in a particular time, in a specific place, in a particular ethnic group. Jesus was and always is culturally and historically specific. Of course, Jesus can and does, in our world presently, I think, incarnate in various cultural contexts, but the fact is that there's no just kind of generic Jesus floating out there, no abstract Jesus outside of time and space. Jesus is always and everywhere particular, embedded culturally and historically. He's the same Jesus in every place and time, but he's never known to us in any other way than in a particular set of cultural constraints, in a particular cultural incarnation. This has been one of the ways in which the nearness of Jesus has been highlighted for me in my life following him. Jesus has consistently led my wife Hannah and I into contexts and into relationship with those very much unlike us. To see what Jesus looks like taking on flesh very much unlike ours, so that we don't universalize our particular experience of Jesus and miss out on who he is. I suppose that's some of what I'm trying to capture with this composite picture of Jesus that we're using for this series. I'm hoping that we'll wrestle both with the fact that Jesus is known to us only in a particular context, but also that no one of those contexts, right, can be universalized. And if that rubs us the wrong way, then perhaps that's good, I think, right? If that rubs us the wrong way, then that's, I think, we're starting to get something about the person of Jesus, about the nearness of Jesus, because this is the scandal of the incarnation. God becoming so much like us, God becoming embarrassingly small, shockingly pedestrian, alarmingly particular. And if you want to understand the centrality of Jesus' nearness and of the scandal, the proof is how regularly those who encounter him in the Gospels are upset because they think that he's too near. He's come too close. Perhaps to the wrong people. In the Gospels, Jesus is consistently upsetting people by becoming too close. He talks with women. He touches dirty, sick people. He parties. He even miraculously provides more wine when the wine runs out. It all looks a little too pedestrian, too particular, too small and familiar. And we could pick any number of stories. I just picked one from Mark in chapter 2. It says, as Jesus walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, that's interesting, Levi was following Jesus, and Jesus ends up at Levi's house. Jesus must have led Levi there. Seriously, we should think about that. He goes to the tax collector's house. Many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many of that kind of folk who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." In a certain way, this story is actually quite typical. I said we could pick any number of these. Jesus is constantly getting in trouble for this sort of thing. As Jesus has pursued this tax collector, this traitor of his people, collecting taxes for the foreign occupying force. And then Jesus decides that they're all going to Levi's house, as I pointed out, right? Levi's following Jesus, but Jesus leads Levi right back to his house and asks him apparently to throw a party. And the party is as one would expect, or rather as the religious leaders feared. Levi's dinner guests are also tax collectors and sinners. Sinners here may be a euphemism for prostitute. At any rate, the Pharisees are upset. Why does he eat with these folks? Why does he hang out with them? And you have to understand, sharing a meal in the ancient context was an intimate affair. Dinner guests reclined at the table together. Literally, this text that you got translated as saying Jesus was at his house eating dinner, it literally says, while Jesus was lying down at Levi's house. If there are prostitutes at this dinner, this scene would not have looked good, right? Hence the religious leaders' question. For these religious folk, Jesus is too close, too near. And Jesus isn't surprised because he's prepared with a response. He explains, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but rather sinners." In a certain sense, Jesus concedes the religious leaders' fears are valid. Maybe I'm not for you if, in fact, you are right about your self-assessment, right? The fact that Jesus is so near is bad news if we think we're well. Jesus' nearness to the ill means that he could be a source of contagion to us. Or perhaps even more to the point, Jesus' nearness to all means that whatever sort of privilege we were hoping to have because of our allegedly superior cultural status is gone. But the nearness of Jesus is good news, is great news, if we understand that whoever we are sick. We're in need of a doctor. I think this is the most important way that I've experienced the nearness of Jesus in my own life. At the low points, at those points at which my desperate need of healing is most apparent. When against every rational instinct, I'm directing all of the frustration of my day into anger at my wife, or worse, my daughter. Or when despair is swirling around and I just decide to give in. When I've given in to internet pornography and found myself again at the bottom of that particular well. When the news of a professional success of a friend reveals envy in my heart rather than my being able to share in their joy. When the brokenness, the ugliness of my soul is revealed, I have again and again found that Jesus is not further at a distance, but in fact, in a certain sense, he's come yet closer. It can be unnerving, actually, upsetting in a certain way. To be in a moment of what you hoped might be private shame and instead find that God, in the person of Jesus, is in fact especially present. But I found that it is simply fundamental to who Jesus is, fundamental to his character, that he continues to draw near to us in these moments when we most need a doctor. He meets us where we're at. He comes to make us well. And that's so key, right? So important that Jesus is not afraid to name our illness, to just say it like it is, to name my sin. It's crucial. In taking on our skin and drawing near, we ought by no means imagine that Jesus is pandering. Jesus is not just trying to fit in. Indeed, as much as it is a fundamental characteristic of his person that he meets us where we are, it's just as characteristic that Jesus stands, in a certain sense, at a great remove from us as well. He moves into the neighborhood, but he also stands out. He doesn't quite fit into what we've got going on. We might say it this way: he corresponds to the very best of what God might have intended for us, but he fits much better than we do into that ideal. He sticks out, not like a sore thumb, but like a perfectly healthy thumb on a leprous hand. No doubt Jesus is foreign to us. When we compare our lives to his, when we compare our default instincts to his, Jesus is quite strikingly different. The difference, John says, is like light and darkness. But Jesus' light is the light of humankind. It's intrinsic. It may be foreign to our lived experience, but it's the very core of what we were made to be. That's why Jesus' life, when we read about it, when we really consider it, this is why Jesus' life convicts us. Because it stands in such stark contrast to our lives as they are, while resonating so deeply with life as it ought to be. And John reflects on this irony several times in this passage, this correspondence, this deep correspondence that Jesus has, and yet this total disconnect that comes at the same time. He says, though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. The light shines in the darkness, he says, and the darkness has not understood it. But in these failures to be recognized, to be received, to be understood, Jesus isn't failing in his role as the Word. In fact, these moments of disconnect are where I think he succeeds most of all. Philosophers of language will tell us that sometimes words communicate most powerfully when they fail to be understood. Think about it. When a friend is just carrying on exactly as you would if you were talking about the same thing that they're talking about, you're not learning anything. Your world is not being transformed. It's just being confirmed, just as it is. And sometimes that's helpful and important. It's one thing we do with language. But those life-altering conversations, those ones, they all come with a moment of surprise. Your friend puts something familiar in a surprising way. They turn a paradigm on its head. They speak correction, but with gentleness rather than harshness. This is precisely what John says was true about Jesus. Jesus, the Word, the light, was not understood, and this is why he was not overcome. These are two different ways of translating the same Greek word. I think it's a play on words going on here. The darkness has not overcome the light. The darkness has not understood the light. We could capture some of this in English if we translated it that the darkness has not grasped it. If Jesus were grasped, if he were understood entirely, he would be entirely within our grasp, under our power. Instead, Jesus incarnates. He communicates himself to us. And the very essence of that self-communication is that if we listen rightly, we hear just enough to be confused. Just enough to be brought up short. Just enough to be puzzled and not quite grasping. In fact, we ourselves are grasped. We're taken hold of by the one who holds us in his very person, the light that is the life of all. This is so important if, as I suggested at the outset, we want not just to know Jesus as one who is near to us, but in fact, if we also want to imitate his nearness, take on in our own lives the nearness of Jesus. John summarizes it with this pair that we see a couple times, this pair, grace and truth. Jesus' nearness is typified by this pair. Jesus' nearness is first an encounter of grace. As he pursues us in love, he moves into the neighborhood, he dares to draw near even in our brokenness. And yet, in this experience of grace, there is also an encounter with truth. Uncompromising, unyielding, totally foreign to all that is false within us. And if we want to be people who would follow Jesus and would imitate his nearness, we'll have to dare to do the same. We'll have to dare to enter people's worlds with generosity, with grace. Dare to go to them, not wait for them to come to us. We'll have to, dare we make it so particular, move into the neighborhood, as so many of folks in this community can tell you about. We'll have to enter into people's worlds. We'll have to enter into what makes their world significant to them. We'll have to enter in on their terms, unafraid of their otherness, unafraid that we'll become infected. And that's not easy. If you've tried to do this cross-culturally, heck, if you've tried to do this in your marriage, you know how quickly the grace can run out. Jesus can't just be our model here. He has to also be our source so that we can live that generous posture of grace as we follow Jesus in incarnating into other people's worlds. In our relationships, daring to really look at a conflict from somebody else's point of view. across class lines, daring to lay down our innate sense that our position is rightly superior or inferior to another's. It's hard, and we'll need Jesus to be our source in that. And it's good that, in fact, he is the Word, as John tells us. This is what he's about. Difficult as that is, there's yet something else required if we are going to be able to imitate the nearness of Jesus. We'll also have to live in ways that testify to truth. Not our truth, but God's truth. Or better yet, we ought to live in ways that always and everywhere testify to Jesus, who is himself in his person, John tells us. Jesus is himself the truth. We'll have to live in ways that will make us foreign just when we thought we were fitting in. Having to call out sin when we see it in the lives of our friends into whose neighborhood Jesus has invited us to move. Daring to love not just our enemies, but the enemies of our friends. You know, that feels like betrayal often, right? You go love your enemies, that's fine. You start loving my enemies, and I feel like you're not on my side anymore, right? But what if Jesus calls us to do that thing? I've gotten torpedoed for that more than once. This is hard, but it's what makes our presence transformative. And it's the way that Jesus will lead us if we really listen for his voice, because it's fundamental to his character. A friend of mine recently told me about an adventure that Jesus brought her on, an adventure that really embodies this tension between grace and truth that typifies the kind of peculiar nearness of Jesus. She's telling me a friend of hers that she's been trying to get to know, a documentary filmmaker who my friend felt like Jesus had been encouraging her to get to know, to kind of move in the neighborhood, as it were. This filmmaker invited her to come help out on a shoot that he was doing. My friend figured, fair enough. She'd go help out. It was only after they were already on the way to the shoot in the car that my friend thought to ask what the topic of the documentary was. The filmmaker told her that he was working on a documentary on the lives of C-list adult film actresses, women living on the fuzzy line between the adult film industry, prostitution, and human trafficking. My friend was a bit alarmed, but figured Jesus had something for her on this adventure, right? So she prayed as they drove along the way. As the filmmaker was doing his interviews, my friend sat with the other women waiting to be interviewed, still praying, just trying to be open to what it might look like for her to be near in this environment. And she talked with these women about their lives, about their hopes and dreams and their stories, and she listened. And after she listened for a while, they began to ask her about her life. And so she told them about kind of her life and the adventure that she'd been on with Jesus and who Jesus was. And as they were wrapping up, the exchange seemed meaningful to her. The women asked her for her phone number, and she gave it to them. But she went home that day, still kind of wondering what God was up to in it. Until later that week, two of these women called her up and told her that because of their conversation with her, they wanted to start following Jesus and were quitting their jobs in adult film, which meant that they had some very particular practical needs, like a place to live. Their housing was arranged by their boss. And so they were out on the street, and so my friend had to quickly turn to her church and to another church that she knew in the area might have resources to help her out. My friend doesn't live here in Connecticut. But the last I talked to her, these women were both still chasing after Jesus, receiving healing, and finding new community in their churches and new life in Jesus along the way. My friend's horizons, of course, have been just expanded substantially, right, through these relationships that have begun. It's an astonishing story, right? I was flabbergasted at my friend when she told me this on our way to dinner after I hadn't seen her for a while. But it's just such a Jesus story, right? It has his character all over it. Jesus leading my friend to dare to be present in the most unlikely of contexts, to listen, to engage, and to speak boldly about Jesus, who is himself the truth. So as we prepare for a time of response, I sense God has a few questions for us to consider. We've talked about these a bit, but I'll pop them up here. First, how is God inviting you to respond to his nearness in the person of Jesus, in his grace and his truth? And perhaps you're here today, and the idea that God is near is itself a bit strange, a bit foreign. But you've got a hunch kind of growing that it's true, that this other is somehow near precisely in his strangeness. That's the grace of Jesus. If that's you, I would encourage you, take the opportunity to respond, to say yes, as John put it, to Jesus' offer to become a child of God. If that's you, if that's where you're at, I'd love to talk with you. Perhaps during communion in a few moments, I'll be sure to sit over there, and I'd love to just chat with you, kind of hear what's going on, pray for you. Or perhaps there's an area in your life in which Jesus is near, perhaps distressingly near, and inviting you to step forward in truth. Is there sin that he's inviting you to confess, for which he's inviting you to seek forgiveness? Communion will be a great opportunity to engage with Jesus about that stuff. And second question, in what relationship in your life is Jesus daring you to extend yourself in grace? Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe it's with a friend, a neighbor, a coworker. Maybe it's with someone that you hardly know yet because they live across some deep cultural gap. For some of us, that actually is our physical neighbors. What would it look like for you to take the risk to initiate, to adopt a listening posture and try to see how their world works? What makes their world significant to them? Third, where is Jesus daring you to testify? Where is God daring you to testify to Jesus, who is himself the truth? I talked a fair bit about this already. This can be uncomfortable. I think by nature it is uncomfortable. But I think it's also the way that our lives get the sort of transformative, impactful edge that Jesus' life had, and the kind of character that he'd like our lives to have as well.